Hello, so we're going to move on from logic gates, and as I said, we will be picking all that up in year 11 because we'll have to practice exam questions. So if you felt a bit confused by the logic gates and you didn't quite get there, don't worry about it. Okay, the next one we're going to look at now is computer architecture and understand the structure and purpose of something called von Neumann's architecture. Okay, so now the standard structure and the purpose of von Neumann's architecture is for bronze. Then you're going to understand the role of the address bus, control bus, and data bus for silver. And then for gold, you're going to understand each unit of the architecture. Okay, so now computer systems haven't always been the same. They've evolved over many years. So if we look at the 1960s computer system, which basically was around before I was born and was around probably when the school opened, okay, you're going to see a very different computer system. Now, computer systems back then aren't like what you see today. They were more mechanical and they couldn't work without human convention. So this is how a computer system worked in the 1960s. So you would enter the room with a deck of punched cards. Now, these punched cards had the data on them, okay, and it's how the data was read. So when we've looked at how CDs and DVDs were burnt, they used a series of pits and lands, okay? So if we look at these punch cards, it would have read data almost in a similar way. These would have just been a bunch of ones and zeros, maybe. You would switch the computer on, then the punch cards would be placed in the reader, which is, if I can find my mouse, around here, okay? And you notice something? No touch screen, no monitor. Then you place the punch tape in the reader, as you can see here. Push the button to run the program. Press the button to print out the tape. And then you switch the computer off, okay? So there was no apps, there was no games, there was nothing like that. And then you'd leave the room with your punch cards. That simple, okay? Because computers back then didn't do what they do now. Now, computers are designed basically to do what we can do as humans, but do them much faster. And that is what the computer would have done back then. So that is an earlier form of a computer. So the 1960s computer system, the user would control the computer hardware by simply pressing buttons to control the mechanisms, because they was very mechanical. Now, the missing component obviously was an operating system. So there was no Windows, no iOS, no Android, none of that around. And the operating system, okay, is the system software that controls the hardware, okay? But that wasn't the case back then. So prior to this, we would control each aspect of the hardware ourselves, okay? But it was this guy, John von Neumann, who was a Hungarian American. In 1945, he came up with the idea of a stored computer program. So you're probably thinking, well, if he came up with the idea in 1945, why wasn't it around in the 1960s? Well, these things actually take time. So like, for example, I believe the first television set was developed in 1890. They wasn't really around in a domestic household until the 50s in America, and I think the 60s in the UK. So this it's been referred to as the von Neumann architecture. So his idea was for the computers to hold the data in memory, okay? Then it could move between the memory unit and the processor. And this is still relevant today because this is basically how our computers work. Our operating system is held in the memory. So whether we switch the computer off or not, it's still going to be there. And then we've got memory that holds the startup instructions to the computer so it starts up. So really his idea was for computers to become automated. Now this is the simple model right here, okay? So we've got the processor, which includes the control unit. Then we've got the memory unit, and we've got the input and the output, and these are devices, the input and output devices, okay? So like the keyboards, you know, maybe the punch card decks back then, and obviously the output device would be what prints out. So now this is the address bus, this is the data bus, and this is the control bus. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to talk a little bit more about the buses and what they do. Okay, so firstly, let's look at what is a bus. Well, basically, it's no more really than a set of wires between the components. Okay, so these things can be considered, oops, I can't find my mouse. Where is it? Oh, there we are. These things can be considered buses that would plug into here. Some of these printed circuits would be buses. Okay, so they're just basically wires where the data flows in between them. Okay, so they can connect together several peripherals as well. So peripherals is anything that plugs into a computer, like a mouse, a keyboard, a printer, and a monitor. And obviously, the data has to travel to those components. So what does each bus do? Well, here's a brief description of each bus. So the address bus, this is the bus that carries the signal relating to the addresses between the processor and the memory. And it is unidirectional and it travels in one direction only, okay? So it will only travel in one direction. Then you've got the data bus. So this is the bus that sends data between the processor and the memory unit, between the input and output devices. So meaning if you want to print a document, that's the data that goes. And it's bidirectional, so the data can travel in both directions. So I suppose if you think of the analogy here, I want to print a Word document. So then that information will go to the printer, but then if there's a problem, it will come back up on your screen maybe and say, there's a problem, can't print. Then you've got the control bus. So this carries the signal relating to the control and coordination of all the activities within the computer, like the read and write only functions. So for example, when you open up a document and it says you can only read this document, you can't, you know, write it, and so on. So the signal will travel in one direction only here. This is unidirectional. So what is an address bus? Let's go in a little bit more deeper. So this is the component that carries an address to the memory controller to identify a location in the memory that is to be read to or written from, okay? Read to or written from. So you can think of this, I suppose, like your postman, okay? So your postman has your letters and he takes them to your address. Or maybe if you want to think of it as like the pigeon carrier in Harry Potter, okay? When he delivers the letter to Harry Potter to say that he has to go to Hogwarts. Okay, oh sorry, the owl I meant. I meant like a wartime pigeon carrier. There we go. Right, then we've got the data bus. What does the data bus do? So this is simply a component, you know, like a part of the computer that carries the data to and from the processor. Okay, so the processor is the brain of the computer. So obviously some information has to go to the processor for it to be processed. Then other information has to come from the processor so the computer can actually work and do what it's supposed to do. So think of this as like your school bus, okay? So, you know, you guys need to go from your home to school. Imagine school was the processor. Then you need to go back home again sometimes, okay? And then we've got a control bus, okay? This is basically is like a computer bus that is used by the CPU to communicate with the devices. Okay, so this control stuff, so this is your controller. So it has to communicate with the devices so the physical connections and the physical parts of the computer work, okay? So all this data moves around inside the computer using a bus. So like, for example, how you may move from school and to home using a bus, or when you go on a school trip. Okay, so like when, you know, for one of your school trips, you had to go to the sewage plant. Well, you took a bus there, then you took a bus back to school, okay? Right, so looking at this in a little bit more detail now, okay, so this is a bit more of a detailed diagram of the unit, okay, of the architecture. So here, this is the memory unit, and it consists of the RAM, and it's directly accessible by the CPU, Okay, so the CPU is basically here. This is the processor. So it needs the memory unit. Now, as you know, the memory unit, okay, will contain things like the startup instructions for the PC or for your laptop or whatever. So when it starts up, that needs to be, you know, directly addressed with the CPU to actually start up. This is the electrical circuit or the brain of the computer that is responsible for executing all the instructions. Now, your computer is not going to work without a CPU, like you cannot work without a brain. And then we've got a control unit here. Okay, so the control unit controls the operations of the computer's ALU. Okay, and the memory and the input and the output, telling it how to respond to the program's instructions. Okay, to read and interpret from the memory. Okay, so this is a control unit where all the information goes through. Okay, so you've got your, so this is not a PC, it's a computer, this is a programmer counter. Okay, so and it counts how many programs are going through the control unit. And then you've got your input device that goes straight to the memory unit. Okay, right, we're obviously going to go into this in more detail next lesson as well. But what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to reaffirm your knowledge. This is the sheet I'd like you to complete. Now, you will have to download this onto Word, or if you don't have Word, then, you know, you can do this on a normal document. So what I'd like you to look at is the big picture. What is von Neumann's architecture? What is the control bus? What is the address bus? Why is von Neumann's architecture relevant to modern computing? Obviously, you can look that up. What is the data bus? What is the control unit? What is the processor? And what is the memory unit? Okay. And once you've done that, hopefully all the ideas in your head will be a bit more solid. Okay. Very best of luck.